Why is Russia attacking Ukraine? Can anything be done to stop Putin? And just how far could this conflict go? This is what you need to know. Hello, I'm ITV News presenter Nina Hossain, and welcome to this emergency ITV News podcast. After Russia finally launched its major military assault on neighbouring Ukraine. Earlier we had a statement from the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who said the UK cannot and will not just look away at Russia's hideous and barbaric attack on Ukraine. Joining me are our team of experts from around the world to tackle the key questions in this rapidly moving crisis. Our Europe editor James Mates is in Ukraine, our correspondent Neil Connery is in Moscow, our US correspondent Emma Murphy joins me from Washington, and our international affairs editor Rageh Omaar is alongside me here in London. James, if I can start with you, take us back to the early hours. How did this invasion begin?
Well, it began with air raid sirens going off here in Kiev, with the sound of explosions as airports and military air installations around this city and elsewhere in the country were the first targets of the attack. We then saw, largely on CCTV border post video, tanks rolling literally down the roads and into Ukraine, not just the bits of Ukraine that Putin had spuriously claimed on Monday, not just the areas in the far east of the country where they do have a large Russian-speaking population, and where he has always claimed he was looking after his fellow Russians, even without regard to how little they wanted to be looked after by him. But these were in the south and in the north of the country from Belarus as well. So this was it very quickly became clear that this was a large-scale invasion of the whole of the east of the country on a very broad front.
Peace suddenly shattered. How did ordinary Ukrainians respond? We've seen those scenes, haven't we, of those queues of cars trying to leave the capital.
Yeah, well, not surprisingly, and particularly here in the capital, people have tried to get out. US intelligence has warned that there would be a lightning attack on Kiev itself in an attempt to decapitate the regime, and that prompted a lot of Ukrainians who could to queue for petrol, to queue at ATMs and try and get a hold of any money that they could, and then head out in a westward direction, and who can blame them? That wasn't necessarily the case in other cities, largely I would think, because Kiev sits pretty much on the western edge of where the Dnieper River runs north to south and divides Ukraine into a sort of an eastern and western half. It's widely thought that however widespread a Russian invasion would be, it would not initially at least try to go west of the Dnieper, and therefore there was a logic to leaving Kiev and trying to head off towards Poland in that direction. If you're in the northeast city of Kharkiv, or if you're in Mariupol in the south, or anywhere else, then it's 5, 6, 7, 8 hours drive before you even get to that to the line of that river. So much less point in actually moving, and better just to try and sit tight and stay in shelter.
Crucially, James, how do you think Ukraine will respond to this?
Well, he is responding by fighting for all it's worth. Now, it's absolutely not clear, where are we, 9, 10 hours after the first troops invaded. It's not clear at all how successful they're being. We know they've had some success. There have been pictures on social media of tanks and helicopters that have been destroyed, and of aircraft that have been shot down. Whether these are isolated incidents or whether what's happening at the front, where we're not seeing, or we're certainly not getting reliable information, whether they are managing to fight successfully there, we don't know. The two big unknowns here are how well equipped and motivated and trained are the Ukrainians. They're much better than they were 8 years ago, but even so, it's not clear how good they are, and also how motivated are the Russians to fight this. While everyone expects the Russians will win overall, just through sheer weight of arms and weight of numbers, whether they can make this into some sort of blitzkrieg, a lightning war, and have it all over in a few days, or whether this is going to be a long, hard slog for them, that's very much an open question.
All right, James, let's bring in Neil in Moscow. Ultimately, what does Vladimir Putin want to achieve? What are his ambitions? Why did he set out on this journey?
I think a lot of people have been warning about this day for months, and people are just taking stock of it here in Russia this morning, trying to make sense of it. In terms of why President Putin has done this, I think let's not forget, he's a former KGB man. I think this has been at least 22 years in the making, what has happened here today. I mean, he said many times before that he saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And what he is about is he sees his legacy as trying to rebuild a greater Russia. And he expresses it in terms of trying to keep NATO's eastward expansion at bay. That is the threat that he says he sees. I think sometimes when that point is made, what's lost is the fact that those countries where NATO has arrived, like the Baltic states, they also bring democracy with them. And I think for President Putin, that is the threat on his borders, democracy creeping nearer to Russia's borders, and what that could mean for his leadership, for the way things are done in this country. That, I think, is another risk that sometimes isn't talked about. So I think those are broadly the reasons why he sees Ukraine should be brought back under Russian control by whatever means it takes, at whatever cost.
Let's bring in Rageh. You were nodding at a lot of what Neil was saying there in terms of what President Putin is thinking right now.
I think it's very important, as Neil and both James were saying, that it's very easy from us here in London, or whether you're in Washington or other sort of Western liberal democracies, to see this as a sort of through straight lines. This doesn't mean this is against international law. It will cost Russia. That's not the way that Vladimir Putin sees the world. He has an entirely different historical narrative, as we were just hearing there, and that's very important in terms of what options we have to deter him, whether he can be deterred, and also what this means in the longer term with regard to how we figure out what to do with other Eastern European and Baltic states, which will face the same threats because they are democracies and they want to join NATO. So that's very important. We see things in a straight line. Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin does not, and they're two different sort of parallel universes. Having said that, I also do believe that, as James was sort of referring to earlier, this will be a long slog. I just don't see how, whatever shape that the Ukrainian defense forces are left in after being inevitably overwhelmed by Russia, this doesn't end up in the way that we experienced our presence in Iraq and Afghanistan. People will fight. That's what happens. We open your history books, whether it's the French in Algeria, the Americans in Vietnam. So what will be the longer term cost is really the most important thing. It's horrible to say this in such a devastating and dark moment for Europe's history, but this will provoke a series of challenges for Vladimir Putin. He has to some extent boxed himself in, because it's easy to get in. It's much, much more difficult what you do with a country once you invade.
The assessment of the long-term impact, though, is a very difficult message for people to hear, especially when we are still in the midst of a global pandemic. Let's get more about how the world has reacted and what sanctions could potentially stop President Putin. Emma, is there regret in America that the sanctions led by President Biden clearly weren't enough to stop Putin, this invasion that was predicted overnight? It happened.
Well, the sanctions that they've put in over the past few days were seen to be punitive and also hoped to be a deterrent, and obviously that has come to pass as not the case, although you would have to question just whether or not sanctions were ever going to be enough to try and stop President Putin. He appeared to be set on this path, and he doesn't think in the same way that perhaps Western democracies do. Of course, sanctions will have an effect on him. They will have an effect on Russia. They will have an effect on those around him, but whether or not they were ever going to really knock him off course, that is the question that appears to have been answered by the events of the past 10 hours or so. In terms of the president, he says that he is going to increase those sanctions, but he knows that he will have to really put them at a level that is beyond anything that either Russia or potentially some of the Western countries will be able to cope with, to have a really, really significant effect. And of course, let's think about the character dictator that we're dealing with here in terms of Vladimir Putin. He has tried to shake the world order for so many years and got away with it unchecked. You say to me in the beginning of the question, will there be a regret that sanctions have not worked? Perhaps there should be a regret at what has been allowed to happen over the past years. We only need to cast our minds back to 2008, his moves into Georgia, look back to 2014, Crimea, Donbass. Then, of course, there were the attacks in the UK on the Skripals. Then there was the attempts to affect the American election in 2016, and of course his very, very damaging policies in Syria, the attacks that took place there. He got away with all these things without any real impact. So of course he was going to feel that he could come in and really shake the world order, as he now has done. The president will have to weigh up what the next options are. He has been very clear there will be no US troops deployed to Ukraine, but there is that big issue of NATO countries on Ukraine's border, and that is a very, very dangerous prospect. He's in the White House now. He has met with his National Security Council to discuss where they go from here. He will also be speaking to members of the G7 later this morning and then addressing the American people. That address will really be something that is directed at the Kremlin, where he will be hoping to get a message to President Putin with an optimistic hope of de-escalation. I'm not sure anybody here really believes that at this point there is any chance of de-escalation at any point soon.
Yeah, everyone will be watching that, of course. Emma, thank you. Rageh, this talk of shaking up the world order, give us the context. A lot of people are talking about World War III. Can you reassure us that that's not what we're looking at?
I can't in the longer term, because I mean this is a black and white sort of conflict really between liberal democracies and the ability of nations, free nations, to choose their own path, and another alternative worldview that says no, this, you know, something has to happen in a way that Russia dictates. Does this go, if this goes beyond Ukraine and it touches Poland, it touches Estonia, then NATO will have to react militarily. So I can't say that. But I just want to go back to, for us, and it's important for our listeners and viewers to understand, it's going to be very difficult to detach ourselves from our dependence on Russia on multiple levels here in this country. I know there's been a lot of talk about Russian money in the City of London and thousands of lawyers and bankers and hedge funds in which, you know, billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars have filtered their way into our system. It pays for schools, it pays for, you know, police on the street. It is infected in our system. I mean, just to give you an example, today, according to, I mean, the Bloomberg Financial sort of information service, the UK, European Union countries and the US are going to buy 3.5 million barrels of Russian oil today and about 275 million cubic feet of gas. At today's prices, that's $700 million today into Vladimir Putin's coffers. It's going to be a long while to, you know, take that out of our system, and it's going to be very, very difficult. The sanctions will take a long time. I think he's got a lot of options in that regard. His problem is, how does he take over and control and occupy Ukraine?
Rageh, thank you very much. Thank you to Rageh and to James, Emma and Neil, correspondents across the world there dealing with what happens next. You can follow all of our experts on Twitter, including several of our reporters who, like James, are on the front line of this conflict in Ukraine. All of them are sending up-to-the-minute analysis and reports for the ITV News website, while our digital team brings you the very latest breaking news. And of course, we will continue to get these emergency podcasts to you to tell you what you need to know as this invasion continues. Thank you for listening.